The evolution of queer cinema. Chances are you've seen some form of positive queer representation on film in your lifetime. But way back in the first half of the 20th century, rules existed that banned any mention of queer people from movies. The Hays Code, a set of censorship guidelines for major studio films created by politician Will H. Hays in order to protect general audiences from observing immoral content, lasted from 1934 to 1968. The Hays Code banned any reference to or depiction of sex perversion in films. Films made during the time of the Hays Code used queer coding to portray queer characters on screen through subtext without having to cut out any scenes. After the Hays Code, queer characters could finally step out of the dark, homophobic closet and start to have happier endings and deeper understandings of their identities. Understanding how queer cinema has evolved from bigoted caricatures to multidimensional and humanizing depictions of queer characters can give insight into the immense progress the film industry has made in terms of positive LGBTQ+ representation on screen. Films during a time in Hollywood known as pre-code, before the Hays Code, often portrayed queer people as caricatures or offensive stereotypes. The effeminate gay male characters nicknamed pansies, who never actually kissed other men, exemplified these stereotypical depictions. On the flip side, women occasionally certified their queerness by kissing other women, notably Marlene Dietrich in 1930s Morocco. Though Morocco ultimately regresses to heterosexuality, its queer representation was revolutionary. Then, in 1934, everything changed. The Hays Code banned movies from displaying anything non-conventional. Notable films that had to use queer coding to get past censors during this era include Rebecca, in which Mrs. Danvers seems to have had a special relationship with her former mistress, and Strangers on a Train, in which Bruno obsessively stalks Guy in order to become close friends with him. Just because films during this period subtextually represent queer people doesn't mean that the films represent queer people in a positive light. The majority of these films portray queer characters as evil or sinful loners who get killed or killed themselves. With the fall of the Hays Code in 1968 came the rise of a new flourishing age of queer cinema. Bye-bye queer subtext, hello camp, an exaggerated expression of queerness. Musicals like The Rocky Horror Picture Show and Victor Victoria embody the campy queer films of the 70s and 80s. Other films released during this time have more serious explorations of identity, like The Boys in the Band. These films reflect just some of the challenges queer people, but more often than not white gay men, had to face at the time. From internal homophobia to coming out. At least no one died at the end. Subsequently, the 90s gave birth to a film movement known as New Queer Cinema. In these films, LGBTQ+ protagonists rebelled against conventionality. Movies with bankable stars like River Phoenix brought queer films to mainstream audiences. New queer cinema also introduced many groundbreaking documentaries, namely The Celluloid Closet and Paris is Burning. The 90s was a huge turning point in exposure for queer movies and filmmakers. Finally, in the 21st century, progressive queer films with multi-dimensional characters have a place in mainstream cinema. Movies like Tangerine, Saving Face, Tomboy, and Carol receive more funding and thus are enjoyed by larger audiences. Reviewing the history of queer cinema can give insight into how much LGBTQ+ representation on screen has evolved. From the one-dimensional pansy and tragic endings for queer characters in the first half of the 20th century to the multifaceted explorations of identity of the 21st century.